evaluation method and identify the participants, the techniques used, the representative tasks to be examined, the measurements of what would be appropriate, and an outline plan for carrying out the evaluation. Alright? So, first thing you need to think about is, so what is this theatre booking system going to look like? Well, it's replacing the queues at the box office. Right, so when people go to the theatre and they're queuing at the box office, what are they doing? What tasks do you do when you're queuing at the box office?
They're waiting.
They're waiting for
In the queue to buy a ticket.
To buy a ticket? Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, what else do they do apart from buy a ticket?
Selecting movies or selecting the thing that they want to watch.
Thinking about which ones they want to, which sessions they want to go to or something like that, yeah?
Choose the type of the seat, front or back.
Yeah, so in some cases they'll choose where they're going to sit, yeah?
If they are family.
Yeah, so could be families, yes, or individuals or groups or
The payment method.
yeah, so I'm not worried about what they do when they get to the front of the queue. I'm saying, okay, so they're standing in the queue. Why might they be standing in the queue? They might be standing in the queue to buy tickets. They might be standing in the queue to because it's easier to make their choice while they're standing in the queue because they know they have to stand in the queue for a long time. And they can see the boards with all the sessions up there and that sort of thing. They, what was the other one we had?
Choose a movie.
Choosing the movie, yeah. Choosing a session, choosing the seats where they're going to sit in the thing. So they might be thinking about that while they're in the queue. Anything else? They might be just collecting pre-booked tickets. So they might have ordered online and just wanting to collect tickets. Yeah? They might be wanting to make inquiries about a group booking. Okay, so they might, be saying they want to take a school group to a Christmas pantomime and they might just be making inquiries. So all of these things are the things that people who are standing at the theatre in the box office queue might be waiting to do. So if we're creating a prototype of a theatre booking system, these are the things that the theatre booking system might want to provide, right? So assuming that we have managed to put them into our prototype for the theatre booking system, how are we going to identify participants? What sort of participants are we going to have for evaluating? Or first of all, what evaluation method are we going to use?
I really like environment, so we just as a prototype of the system.
Okay, if it's a prototype and we want to put it into a real life situation, you need to be very careful to explain to people, particularly with this type of thing, that it is a prototype and that they're not actually going to get their tickets when they do it. Okay, because you're asking them to waste time effectively, because they're still going to have to queue at the box office if it's only a prototype. If it was a Wizard of Oz, though, we could use it, because what we would be doing is having a person behind the machine act as the machine, and they would actually be able to get their tickets at the end of the information that they want, whatever information, whether it was their tickets or information about what screenings were available or whatever. So a prototype might not be the most appropriate thing if you're going to do it in a real world situation. But a Wizard of Oz experiment in this case, where we get the functionality of the system without the full implementation, where we get the functionality of the system without doing the full implementation of the system, that would be appropriate to put into a real world situation. You see why? Because you don't want to ask the random people coming to the theatre to try something out without getting anything from it, okay? But if they can try it out and get the same service that they should at the box office, then it might be appropriate to do, okay? So, let's say we'll go for Wizard of Oz. How do we select our participants?
Age group. Age group.
Age group. Okay, so I think actually if you're going to do a Wizard of Oz type experiment, you would just do it randomly and say, here's the box office and here's an alternative, and just split it. Okay? Because if we're doing that sort of thing, presumably we're going to get more than the 5 or 10 participants that you would normally get for a lot of usability type testing. You're basically going to split the people coming into the theatre, okay? And they're going to choose probably the shortest queue, right? But you'll get a decent sample of people and probably a fairly random sample of people as well, right? So, if you were doing a laboratory experiment for this type of thing though, selecting your participants would be a lot more difficult. Because how would you do your laboratory experiment? You know, typically when you go to the box office, you have one task in mind. Are you going to get people to come into the laboratory just to do one task? Right? That's a big ask of people. Are you going to get people to give them a whole list of tasks that they should do at the box office? Well, it's not very natural anymore then, is it? Right? So, you know, it's very much about what your system is about, what's the most appropriate way of testing it, and that sort of thing. A prototype, I find it hard to see how a prototype would work in this situation, really. Okay, where you're talking about members of the general public who want to come and use the thing. You'd want some sort of functionality to it, I think. Right? Okay, the techniques used. Well, you're probably going to be recording. Right? You're going to need some sort of informed consent. In this situation, when we're talking about Wizard of Oz in a natural environment, you would have to have very clear signposting saying, video recording, this is a new experimental design, we're capturing these things. If you join this queue, you probably would even have a person at the thing to make sure that people understood that they knew that they were consenting to participate in an experiment. Okay, because it's about informed consent. And you know, you have a sign up there in English. How many people are going to read the sign? Even if they can speak English. How many people might have difficulty reading the sign? How many people are coming where English is not their first language? You know, that sort of thing that you need to pay attention to. Do you need to get signed consent from the participants? Maybe, maybe not, okay? In a situation like this, it's a little bit of a grey area. If you can say that they knew that they had informed consent when they joined this queue, and that by joining the queue they gave informed consent, then maybe you don't need to have signed consent. Okay. But you certainly would want to have a video recording so that you can see how people are using the system. Representative tasks to be examined. Well, they're going to be those things that we talked about. It's meant to be replacing the box office, so you look at what the representative tasks at the box office are. And you're going to try and get examples of all of them. But you're not going to, if you're doing a Wizard of Oz type experiment in this situation, you're not going to tell people what tasks they should be doing. You're just going to hope that you get people who are performing those tasks come up to your thing. So this probably is one of those situations where you keep doing your usability testing until you find all your problems. Okay, and you don't have any, you know, you keep running it for as long as you can to make sure that you cover all your cases. Right? If you've got a more controlled experiment, you can get people to say, I'd like you to perform this set of tasks or that set of tasks, or, you know, and cover all your different task sets that way. What sort of measurements would be appropriate?
Surveys, maybe? We ask them after the experiment.
Yeah, so user satisfaction surveys, certainly. What about some quantitative ones? Things that you can measure.
How fast they bought the ticket, or
Yeah,
how fast?
how quickly, once they get to the machine, how quickly can they get a ticket or get the information that they want? How many mistakes do they make when they're trying to find the information that they want? Did they get the seat, if they're looking to book a particular seat in a particular place, could they get what they wanted? That type of thing, you know. Did they get what they wanted? Did they get a ticket for the session at the movie that they wanted? You know, that type of thing. And an outline plan for carrying out the evaluation. I think we've talked about this because we've been talking about what the Wizard of Oz experiment would look like. We've talked about this along the way. So this idea of having splitting the people coming in, getting informed consent as they arrive, and then just recording things as they use the system. Okay, so two more questions. First of all, in a usability test, list 3 reasons why the user's personal data might be challenging and propose solutions to minimise the associated risks.
Because it's something related to the ethics, so we need to be careful about the personal data.
Yeah, so personal data is tricky, and it's become more tricky since May this year with the European GDPR laws. So you're only allowed to collect personal data for specific purposes, and you're only allowed to store it for a specific length of time, and you know, it's very, very restrictive about what personal data you can store and how long you can store it for and how you have to protect it, and you know, basically, it's initially looked quite challenging, and it has been quite challenging. So the university had to adapt practices. For example, student numbers are personal data. We used to list exam results in lists on the wall with student numbers and exam results. Can't do that anymore. Okay, because you can't put the student number next to the personal name. Email addresses are personal data. So you can't just send out, yes?
I think it's very important to explain to the user which kind of information
Yes.
they need and how can they use it.
Exactly.
And also they can collect signature of this or make a contract or something.
Yeah, exactly. So it is very important for the people collecting the data to say exactly what personal data will be stored and how it's going to be stored, how it's going to be safeguarded. And it doesn't have to be a signature, it can be on an electronic form, it can be a box that they tick. But yes, there needs to be consent given for that data, right? So in terms of using the personal data, if you've got if you've collected this data and you've got this really rich data set and it contains all this personal data in it, and then we want to do something with the results of this, and we might want to publish some studies or something like that. It can be difficult to use any individual bit of data. So for example, if you've done a recording and there's a bunch of recordings, and one particular recording shows a really good example of the way that the system wasn't used in exactly the way that was planned, example, and you wanted to use that as an exemplar. But that particular exemplar had something on the screen that personally identified the user, right? So you would have to have some way of redacting that personal information from the user if you were going to publish it, right? There are situations where you can get the users to give informed consent to allow their names to be published or something like that, but it would be very unusual to have more than just a personal identifier like a name attached to them. Okay, you wouldn't want to include their home phone number or their mobile phone number, for example. You know, how would you feel if you entered your mobile phone into a form when you were doing a web form or something like that, and then 5 months later you saw it published in an article, a picture of the screenshot that had your mobile phone number on it? You wouldn't be happy, right? So that's the sort of thing that you need to be thinking about all the time, is how do we, if we're going to be collecting personal data, how much of it is essential in terms of the evaluation of our system, or could we just replace it with dummy data and it would be perfectly acceptable, right? Dummy data, so just, you know, wherever they put something personal in, just replace it by random thing.
A
Okay.
random name.
Random name, random phone number, random.
Yeah, but the results are the previous one from the. I mean, is the original one, but we have to replace the name.
Yeah. So well, that's the question: is how much of it can you replace? Is there certain information in the system where it's going to be necessary in your evaluation later to know that it didn't work because of the particular nature of their personal data? Or is the personal data actually irrelevant to the evaluation of the system? But there might be situations where, you know, it didn't work because they had a phone number with an unusual format, for example. So they tried to put an international phone number in which case that is important information. And, you know, so you need to do a very fine balance between what is the critical information that we need to store and how much can we anonymize any personal data that we store. And generally, you want to get rid of as much personal data as you can, because you don't want to be tasked with maintaining anything about personal data, but you don't want to throw away something that is important. So for example, a person's name might have caused the system to break because they have an unusual character in their name. You know, a C with a cedilla or something like that, and the system just doesn't cope with that type of thing. That's important information. So you need their name in that situation. You know, it's a balancing act. But you want to minimize the risks as much as possible by anonymizing things. Okay, Amazon Dot. Who's seen an Amazon Dot? That's an Amazon Dot. It's a little thing about this big. The Amazon Echo is the big tower thing. It's a speaker, basically with microphones, and you can ask it questions and it can play music. Yeah. So what sort of things would you evaluate with that for usability testing?
The efficiency of the interaction of the system.
Okay. What sort of measures of efficiency would you use?
How long it takes to respond to me.
Yep. So how quickly do you get a response from it? What else?
How many times he doesn't understand you? What you say?
Exactly. So I love these because it makes my kids speak clearly. So my kids tend to mutter and not talk very clearly and that sort of thing. But if they're talking to Amazon, they all of a sudden talk very properly. Right? You do, yeah. And I think that people who have accented voices, which is the vast majority of people in this room, probably find it even more challenging. I know even with my Australian accent, sometimes it doesn't understand me, right? So how quickly it responds to you, how accurate is it in understanding you. What else? We've got two things that we can evaluate. Third one? Yeah, that's valid. So you could. It's not really usability; it's acceptability. That criteria. So, but you know how comfortable the person feels with it in their personal space. You know how likely they are to have it as a feature in their space. But given that's an acceptability feature rather than a usability one, how about another usability one?
Maybe the time of battery.
The time of
Battery.
the battery. It's mains charge. It's got a mains cable, even though it's not shown in this picture. I don't think anything ran off battery. But yeah, that was good. If it ran off battery, that would be certainly one. I would say, to what extent can it answer the questions that the user wants, right? Because you're meant to be able to ask it anything, and it's very good if you say, "What's the weather going to be like?" Right? But sometimes if you ask it, "What time does the next bus leave?" Sometimes they're very good, and sometimes they're dreadful. Okay? And it depends. They are quite location specific, so you register it to be at a certain address, and it will know where the nearest bus stop and everything is. But it depends upon the quality of information that it can access, of course. Right? So if your bus company gives up-to-date data about when the buses are running and when they're running late and that sort of thing, it will give it accurate information, but not otherwise. Okay, so there's three, and you could probably think of other, if you went away and think about it, you could think of other usability ones, but that's three. If you want to learn more about user-centered design, there's a whole bunch of books, a couple of videos available on YouTube, and they're just the tip of the iceberg. There's many, many